let's start with get. That's the simplest REST call that you can make. It's basically get, you put a URL, and then you get some values back. So in this case, it's $HTTP get. You're passing in the URL, which I am configuring here. So a lot of times, once you've extracted that base service, it's basically like you basically, on the specific services on top of that, it's basically URL, here's my payload. And so that's what you're kind of left worrying about on top of the base service. So in this case I'm just saying, here's my base URL, here's my user ID. In production, I would actually get that once somebody is logged in. So I'm setting the URL. So it's HTTP get URL. And then I'm doing success and error. So obviously, if it succeeds, then that's what gets called. If there's an error, that's what gets called. Within that is I am creating a deferred object. So I'm using the queue service, which is based on kind of the promise spec by Chris Kowalowski, or whatever that gentleman's name is. And so I'm creating a queue deferred object, and then I'm returning the promise on that object. From there, so it's create the deferred object, so it's queue defer, you return the promise. When you're ready to resolve it, deferred.resolve. If something goes wonky, deferred.reject. Or you can basically resolve it entirely by calling, I think it's deferred.final. I haven't really needed to use that, but I think there's that one final state within kind of the promise object. But now you can see with that pattern that I've laid out is you've got the deferred object. I'm basically doing the URL. And we'll take this one step further. Is I am setting a payload. So for instance, in post, you want to create a new object. So it's now URL plus your payload. So like I said, it comes down to defining your URL, which is your REST endpoint, and then setting up your payload object. So in this case, URL params, post, URL param success, lo and behold, is you're starting to see this convention. Destroy, same thing. In this case, there's no payload. It's just here's my URL, and I actually want to call destroy. Or delete, actually. But do you guys see the pattern here? Set up your promise, make your call with your URL and your payload if you need it. Then, depending on success or failure, you either resolve or you reject your promise. So now we've looked at it in kind of a service kind of context. How does that bubble up to the big picture in the application? So, as you can see, I have, once again, fan of the revealing module pattern. So here's these methods that I can then call on the board service. So let's jump into a controller and see what that looks like. So remember, I said that when you want to resolve or you actually want to attach a callback to your promise, you use then. So I'm calling board service.find. .then, and so when this resolves, this is what's going to get called. And then I'm passing in two methods in here. The first is the resolve method, and so this is what happens if things go well. And all I'm saying is, okay, this is resolved, scope.boards. And then in Firebase's cases, they'll actually just send you null as a string. And so I'm just simply saying, if it's null, just make it an empty object. So just kind of avoiding any kind of null pointer like nastiness there. I'm trying to reference an object that doesn't exist. Or if something goes wrong, then you just log out your reason, or you can handle that however you want. But let's look here. Same thing. Board service create. I'm sending in the objects that I want to attach to my payload. And when it resolves, which is all the way over here, in this case is I'm just saying scope get boards and I'm just refreshing it. So this is kind of how this works. It's very much convention. Is you have your REST verbs, so it's $HTTP, your verb, your URL. If there's a payload, you attach that depending on what you're trying to do. Success, failure, promise. And then from there, depending on where that promise ends up, is then you handle that with then. Does that make sense? I mean, it's really kind of just a few things, and you do it like once or twice, and you're like, oh, I've totally got this pattern. With that said, is I think invariably somebody's going to ask about resource. When I looked at resource, this was a while back, 6 to 8 months ago, is it was really limited in what you could do. With that said, 1.2 is they are improving resource. That works better with promises. It just does more things. So I was talking to Matthias, yearofmoo.com, that Matthias, and he was like, well, you know, you should really take a look at resources. It's actually really good. It's, you know, you should start using it again. So with that said is, with 1.2 is I will actually revisit that topic. I know that kind of the general consensus among a lot of people is that it's kind of limited. Also, if you really want to do a lot of REST heavy stuff, there's another library out there called RESTangular, and it has a ton of stuff. For most of the HTTP stuff that I've needed to do, the REST stuff, is I haven't needed anything more than the HTTP service. But there's a lot of things you can do with like interceptors. If like, when I make this HTTP call, I need to do some things first. So with 1.2, it's a lot easier to do interceptors. With RESTangular, it's baked in, and so I know some people have really had good success with that. One of the things that I saw was putting up basically a system-wide like kind of loading modal when you did a REST call. And they basically hooked that in using RESTangular's like HTTP interceptor. It's like, well, that's really convenient and well done. So that is